for that. And I thank you for being here. How many parents do we have in the room? Nice. How about AU alums? How about SPA alums? Yes. Thank you for being here. How about students? Nice. It's early for you. I appreciate it on Saturday. It's so good. So in SPA, we have a saying that the 2020 election is our Super Bowl. We all think about what we are doing to prepare our students, to inform them about what's coming, and to get them involved and active in the way that makes sense for them. And if that's our Super Bowl, this is the best pregame show you'll ever be at, I promise you. We are just so happy today to bring you this fantastic panel, and so proud to call the people up here our alums, our faculty, our friends, and it's just really an exciting day. So thank you for being here. I'm only going to do very top-line introductions because we want to leave all the time for a great conversation. But I want to introduce right next to me is Betsy Fischer-Martin. Betsy Fischer-Martin was the executive producer of Meet the Press with Tim Russert for many years, and she is also a proud SPA alumna and also a faculty member in our school, as well as the executive director of the Women in Politics Institute. She has transformed what's going on in this school in 1 year that she's been here, and I'm just so grateful to have her with us. Next to her, we have Michael Steele. You probably know Michael Steele from the work he currently does, and we see him on TV, but more importantly, as the former director of the RNC, and we're grateful to have him here. Next to Michael is Bob Costa. You know Bob. He is, of course, a political reporter with the Washington Post, the moderator of PBS Washington Hour, and a political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He went to another school that we don't like to mention, but he got an honorary doctorate from us a couple years ago, so I claim him as an alum. So we're glad to have him with us. Next to him, we have Amy Dacey. Amy Dacey, also an alum of the School of Public Affairs at American University. She has joined us just recently as the executive director of the Sine Institute for Policy and Politics. That institute is co-sponsoring this event with the School of Public Affairs today. She has come in and got that institute up and running. Exciting things. Please be watching for it. Amy, of course, was the former CEO of the Democratic National Committee, the DNC. And next to Amy, we have Chris Donovan, also an SPA alum. There's a theme here. And he is the executive editorial producer for ABC News. So please join me in welcoming this amazing So now I'm going to turn it over to Betsy, and she's going to moderate today's discussion, and we're going to leave some time for questions at the end. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Vicki. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're here with us. So I want to give a shout out to my class over here. I'm teaching a Saturday class on the women's vote, and so they're over here. And so this morning, at the beginning of our class, I crowdsourced some questions for today from the class. And you won't be surprised about this, but the number one topic that everybody wanted to talk about was the big elephant in the room, impeachment, right? And how that is going to impact 2020. And so I want to start with that. We'll let Bob set the table for us, Bob, if you don't mind. Do a little opening of Washington Week here for us. And give us a sense of where we are now and what's sort of around the corner in this impeachment inquiry.
Thank you, Betsy.
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me?
The TV guy needs instructions. Turn on the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, thank you to Dean Wilkins and the entire American University community. It's great to be here, great to be back. To understand where we are right now, let me take you back 4 weeks from today. 4 weeks ago, I was full of regret. I was sitting in the middle seat on an airplane, Air Force 2, heading from Andrews Air Force Base to Warsaw, Poland. And I was covering Vice President Pence. And I thought that you could not get a more boring assignment than covering Vice President Pence's trip to Poland. And I said to myself, I started to question my life choices. I was hoping Vice President Pence would air a good documentary or movie on the plane, and when he put the movie on, I recognized it was a documentary about Pope John Paul II. Now look, I'm Catholic, I love the good Pope, but it was so boring. and you can't use Wi-Fi on Air Force Two because it's a military aircraft. So I land in Poland in early September, and I'm the pool reporter. That means you chronicle the trip for the rest of the press corps because the rest of the press corps doesn't want to go. And I think to myself, maybe this will be an uneventful trip. I can kind of enjoy it a little bit, walk around Warsaw. And so we're staying at a Marriott hotel in Warsaw. And my first assignment that next day after we land is this meeting in a windowless conference room at the Marriott. And to me it seems humdrum, nothing of a meeting, a bilateral meeting as they say, with President Zelensky of Ukraine. So I go into this meeting and I think immediately it's just going to be an easy story for me to write. Vice President Pence will announce, as I expect, that he's going to give $250 million in military aid to Ukraine. That doesn't happen. Instead, I see President Zelensky, as close as you are to me, start bouncing his knees, nervous, this 41-year-old comedian and actor who just won the presidency of Ukraine in May, unhappy with the Americans sitting right in front of him, John Bolton, Vice President Pence. There's no guarantee from Vice President Pence that this military aid is going to go to Ukraine. And the Ukrainian delegation looks bewildered. And so the press corps, we start shouting out as the pool, are the Ukrainians going to get the money? And Vice President Pence tells us then, and the next day, we're still making a decision on that, but we need to see Ukraine address, quote, corruption. And so I came back to my editors and scratched my head. I said, what is going on here? I know Rudy Giuliani's been making all these moves in the summer, talking about Ukrainian corruption, but this military aid is truly being held up. And that was just 4 weeks ago. 2 weeks from then, the Washington Post scoops that there's a whistleblower complaint, and now 2 weeks from that report, we're here facing an impeachment inquiry on Capitol Hill, all because of President Trump holding this military aid hostage. It's alleged that he maybe had a quid pro quo. That's going to be up for Congress to decide. But every minute now, Vicki called my show Washington Hour. It feels like Washington Hour. A barrage of news and headlines. And every day, Republicans now are being confronted with choices. Democrats are trying to also make choices about whether they can keep this process narrow. And you are all, as American university students, living through history.
Thank you, Bob. I told Bob that his show last night, Washington Week, could have been like a 2 or 3 hour special edition. I feel like there's so much to talk about. Amy, I want to turn to you, and you spent many years at the DNC. So if you can put on your DNC hat for a minute, and give us some insight as to what the party right now is thinking about, how far to move on this. There was some hesitancy at first. You started to see things change. Just from a political standpoint, kind of what's at stake at this moment?
No, thanks so much, Betsy. I think it's a good question because this is a hard needle to thread. Because for many, especially in the committees that have jurisdiction over this, it's what are they responsible to do? Like, what is constitutionally what the responsibility is? We not only elect representatives, we have to hold them accountable as a citizenry. So it's like, what is that question? But then there's this political aspect. We've got a lot of House races up, Senate races. Like, what is the timing? What are people thinking? And I think a lot of it is, as a party, you have to remember, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, Michael, is we talk about the party as this big umbrella, but it's really a series of different committees that are not really held accountable to each other, that focus on the Senate, or they focus on the House races, or the state legislative races. So trying to get consensus on the path forward can sometimes be very difficult from a party perspective. I think what the party's also thinking about, certainly the Democratic Party's thinking about, and as it looked back to 2015 and saw the Republicans go through this, it's what is the focus on trying to get a nominee in place, trying to make sure that we're thinking about, in a national election, how do we localize some of these campaigns within the congressional districts, within these state legislative districts. National campaigns are very important, but we've got a lot at stake as a party, so we're trying to think this through. And I think the other thing, what we're thinking about, is you look at this, impeachment decisions and what's coming forward. As an operative, you always know, it's 121 days till the Iowa caucus. We have 395 days till the general election. So a lot of what we're thinking about is, what do people care about in those 4 early states that actually get to make some of these decisions early on about who they'd like to see as their nominee? And I think that's one of the things that we're thinking through as you're threading this very hard needle. What are the responsibilities, and then what are the implications politically, and trying to pull that together.
Thanks, Amy. So, Michael, how happy are you that you're the former chair of the I want to get your thoughts, though.
Very, very.
Our Republicans, I want to ask you, just thinking about the political component of this, at what point do Republicans start getting nervous about Trump and stop defending him? And it seems like
Funny.
there may be a little bit of a, where do they shift to sort of, he's done something wrong, yes, but he's done something wrong, but we shouldn't impeach him. How are they, what's the political comeback on this, if there is anything?
First off, thank you very much. And for those of you who didn't hear my answer to the question about being the former, it's very good to be the former. I get that question a lot now, what would you do? And I told them I wouldn't last probably past the first 3 months of the administration. Certainly would not have lasted as national chairman after Charlottesville, because my views would have been rather strident and very different from the administration's. And I think that's a reflection generally of where things are right now within the party as a whole. There is this conflict that they have, in my view, created for themselves, because it was a lot easier to abandon principle and values and ideals that had been espoused for generations than it was to stand up to a rogue president. Someone who, as I like to remind my fellow conservatives and Republicans, was not until the year 2015 a Republican, has never been a conservative, and certainly does not now act in that capacity in his current political iteration. So the Republican Party finds itself sitting in this space, Betsy, where it is trying to navigate in this moment, very much as my friend and colleague, Mr. Costa, put on the table, the global as well as the domestic political implications of a decision by the President of the United States to say to the President of Ukraine, I have a favor though. Those words will go down in infamy in this moment and from this moment, because it does indicate a lack of appreciation of the very delicate dance and balance between your political duty and your presidential responsibility. And the political duty is, okay, yeah, we're going to leverage what we got. That's what you do in politics. You try to leverage what you got. But at some point, your presidential responsibility kicks in and says, but in this moment, we will not apply the political duty. We will not leverage politically for ourselves an advantage.
Happen, though.
When does what
When
happen?
does that happen?
It has not happened.
Yeah.
It has not.
Will it happen?
It won't happen. I think we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that the Republican Party as a whole is going to come around and stand against Trump. What you can look for is maybe some chipping away at that particular armor, maybe. He's at 88% approval among rank and file Republicans. Who are these people? I don't know. I have a lot of friends. I look at them, I go, we have to get out of the cult of personality. The party was not this sycophantic about Ronald Reagan, who was that moment where it all became clear for a lot of conservatives around the country. For someone like me, watching this move away from our global responsibilities and our domestic responsibilities, but more importantly, stepping away from the values that we said were so important as Republicans, it's problematic. I mean, look, I can speak with a lot of clarity in this because I worked with Donald Trump. I know Donald Trump personally, talked to him many times throughout the presidential campaign, and I've said to him exactly what I'm saying to you. So I'm not talking out of school. So when you see me and hear me say something about Trump, know that at some point in the campaign, I said it to him. And so it just, I have to be honest and consistent in that respect because of my journey. And so when I look at the party as a whole, it's concerning to me how we get to this moment with any degree of honesty if we don't admit that right now we have a real problem.
Thank you, Michael. So I want to bring in my friend and former colleague, Chris. And I want to tell you first, since this is Alumni Weekend, Chris used to intern for me when I was at Meet the Press. And the way I got to know Chris, because all things are related to AU, when I was an undergrad here, I was in the sorority Delta Gamma, yay. And my little sister in the sorority, after I graduated, was the TA for an American political class, a government class, that Chris was in. And so she made arrangements with me to bring her class in for a special showing of Meet the Press. We let them come in and watch the show on a Sunday morning. And Chris came in her class, and he was completely enthralled and a total political junkie, and said, I want to intern. And so sure enough, he did. And then the rest is history. And now, he spent many years with us at Meet the Press. He was our great producer, terrific research. And now he is leading all of the research efforts that go into the very big political interviews that go on at ABC. So he is attached with George Stephanopoulos and is the brains behind a lot of those great questions that you hear asked at debates and in other interviews. So I'm hoping, Chris, you can take us like a peek behind the curtain at coming from a place like ABC News now and the big interviews that you guys are doing, the debates and whatnot. What goes on sort of behind the scenes as you try to make sense, and you guys try to make sense of the import of this moment and impeachment and getting the facts out and doing some of those big interviews? You guys just had a big Pelosi interview too, right?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I was telling Betsy it was not to date us, but it was 25 years ago. Next month, I started an internship. I have the luxury, I have what I think is the coolest job in journalism, not to offend anyone else, because I think you're awesome. And what everyone does is really cool. But I get to be behind the scenes, and I spend all my time all week just reading and trying to reach out and learn from a diverse group of people on both sides of the aisle, all sides of issues and stuff. And because Betsy and I were both kind of disciples of Tim Russert, we have a strong belief in history and going back and looking back and trying to be reflective on the current events and how history either sometimes repeats itself, or the famous saying, it either repeats itself or rhymes. The history actually doesn't always repeat itself, it rhymes. And also from the school of trying to sit down and be as fair as you can possibly be, looking at all sides of issues. When we approach a guest, of trying to try to think of all the good challenges for that guest, of what people are saying, what they've said in the past. So we did our debate, the third Democratic debate we did at the beginning of last month, or September 12th. And to Robert's point, impeachment had kind of died down. The Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, had repeatedly said what she had been saying about, we're going to let the facts go, but there was no rush to do anything. So we did not ask one question about impeachment. and because we were focused more on where the Democrats were debating each other and where their the key issues of the day and stuff. And then obviously in the last couple of weeks, especially Speaker Pelosi's position has changed with a lot of the news that came out. So George interviewed, so I work mostly with George, and the luxury and why I love my job is I work on all his big interviews, but anytime almost everyone at the network does an interview, I get involved and either just send a few suggestions or think about Betsy knows we keep files. I still keep clipping files, which no one on earth does, of all the candidates and all the politicians going back. And he interviewed both Mayor Rudy Giuliani on Sunday, and we found out like Tuesday at 5 o'clock that he was going to interview Speaker Pelosi Wednesday in the morning. So he stayed up until really late and tried to come up with challenging questions and things, and then we flew down and he interviewed her. So trying to think about, like I said, there's a lot of noise on both sides, there's extremes of both sides, and having to kind of weed through interviews, how Robert's stories, what everyone does, it's subjective right now, like just giving political opinions, but it's subjective on what's important and stuff. I told Betsy, I'm obsessed with the fact that the last 2 times anyone that's lived through an impeachment inquiry or an impeachment process was President Clinton and President Nixon. And both of those came in the second term of their presidency. They were term limited, they could not run again. The only remedy that critics of theirs or people that thought they went too far was to impeach them or censure them or do anything like that. This is a unique situation in that case, in the last 2, that we are less than 13 months from the next election. And I think you're going to hear, and I just actually heard this morning, some Republicans on Twitter talking about trying to make a convincing argument to people that all the facts will be out there and the people should vote on it. They shouldn't cause him to be impeached. And someone can fact check me, one of the journalists I worked with last night, I just thought of this, told me that in the Constitution it says if you're impeached, you cannot run again, which I actually didn't know, and may be wrong, so we should check that, but it's an interesting, I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, an interesting debate, and I brought this up with someone, and they pointed out that Andrew Johnson, the only president, Clinton and Andrew Johnson were the only 2 presidents to be impeached. That happened in an election year, 1868, but I would argue in some ways, I don't think it was in the heart of the election year, but an election year in 1868 is a whole lot different than an election year in 2019 and 2020. And I'll shut up.
Good point, Chris. Thank you. So just to pick up on that, Bob, let me ask you, since it is an election year, and Republican members will be reelected or not this cycle as well, Republicans that you're talking to privately on the Hill, what are they saying right now? And is there a difference between what they're saying privately and what they're saying publicly, as far as you can tell?
There's a stark difference. A few days ago, I was roaming the Senate hallways down by the trains in the basement, and I went up to Senator Ernst of Iowa, a Republican who's up for re-election in 2020. I said, Senator, have you read the whistleblower complaint? She says, Bob, I have not. I said, well, can we talk about the impeachment proceeding? She said, do you want to talk about ethanol? And I said, no, Senator, I don't. With all respect to corn and ethanol. She said, well, if you want to talk about ethanol, I'll talk about ethanol. And then she got on the train and left. And now they're on recess. And she was just facing constituents on Thursday in Iowa. And one of her constituents, as some of you may have seen, asked her in a frustrated way, where is the line? Where is the line? The Republican Party, which I've covered for 10 years, has been so consumed by President Trump that the ideology that has been the connective tissue going back beyond even President Reagan has been replaced by this belief that President Trump is the only one who has political capital to win states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio. And there's a real fear inside of the Republican Party, a fear of President Trump. When Bob Woodward and I interviewed President Trump, then candidate Trump, in March of 2016, that's what he told us his whole operating principle was in terms of power. We asked him, what drives you when you make decisions? How do you see power? He says, I don't even want to say the word. I don't even want to say the word, but it's fear. And Woodward made that the title of his book based on that quote. And we see a Republican Party with Senator Romney of Utah having some standing as a former nominee, Senator Sass of Utah, retiring Republicans like Will Hurd of Texas. There are some voices in the wilderness, but the most likely Republicans to crack will be those who are retiring senators or retiring House members, or then at the next level would be suburban House members who fear they could get swept out in 2020. What's most striking to me as a reporter is how much of this moment for many Republicans who are my sources on the Hill and elsewhere, this moment for them is a political calculation. When I ask them about the moral and legal considerations, they don't really want to engage on those questions. And the Republican Party, President Trump, whether you love him in this room or you detest him, he will be a historic figure because he has overhauled in a major American party in fundamental ways, not just in terms of making protectionism on trade and hardline immigration views the center of the party's entire ideology, but he has made the party all about him. At its core, it is now the party of Trump. And you just 10 minutes ago, I was just filing a story for Sunday's Washington Post about the Republican Party. Pick it up tomorrow morning. I think it'll be A1. We'll see. And I emailed my colleague Phil Rucker because 10 minutes ago, President Trump tweeted, I hope, I'll say the word he tweeted, it's the president. He called Mitt Romney a, quote, pompous ass. And so this is what they're facing. They're facing the wrath of voters. But just one final point on the GOP. When we talk about the GOP, it's not just the Republican National Committee or the congressional ranks. The GOP, in terms of the power structure within the, quote, party, is really Fox News, talk radio, the whole conservative infrastructure that provides all these new figures like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson, real political standing that makes them almost more powerful within conservative politics than elected officials. And so as Richard Nixon had to face Barry Goldwater and elected Republicans, that was what he was really facing down in 1973, 1974. Republicans now aren't really thinking about the party. They're thinking about the wider world of media and activism that confronts them.
Such a good point, Bob. Michael, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bob hit it right out of the park there. I can recall, you probably remember my infamous entanglement with Rush Limbaugh. When I referred to Rush Limbaugh as, I was national chairman, newly minted, as an entertainer. And the backlash within the party was mammoth. In fact, we lost income over a 3-week period. We watched our contributions take a nosedive. That's how powerful that piece, that voice is within the party. And what was ironic about that was when I talked to Rush about it, he laughed and said, yeah, that's basically true. I am. That's what I do. But the politics and the power that was realized was what was most important. And that has just grown exponentially over the years. And it really, I think in the main, we can get caught up in the politics and we can get caught up in the partisanship. And we can scream, I'm a Trumper, or we can scream, I'm a never Trumper. But at the end of the day, folks, it boils down to, are you an American? Because the 3 most powerful words in our founding documents are we the people, not I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat. And when you are a state, to Robert's point about the consumption of a political mindset by one individual, to the point that is sycophantic, to the point that rational facts and evidence are dismissed. The fact that the leader of the free world can refer to the former nominee of his party, a sitting United States senator, as a pompous ass because that senator disagrees with his behavior in his job. That reflects back on us. So we can point fingers at our neighbor and not go to grandma's for Thanksgiving because you still haven't figured out why she voted for Trump. Or talk to your cousin because you don't understand what she was thinking when she decided to support Hillary Clinton. You can have that fight, but then you at some point have to turn that mirror around and look at yourself, because we are where we are and we will remain where we are until we decide something different. And if the election is held today, I think Robert would agree, and I think a lot of the leading indicators are Trump gets reelected. And Wisconsin and it's good. Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania are, bricks in that blue wall that he successfully took out. The question is, how do we respond to that? If, we have some problems, and again, our problems aren't necessarily policy. I mean, I go on TV, I'm not debating healthcare policy. I'm not debating immigration policy.
Why not?
I'm debating about Donald Trump's behavior.
Why not?
And so the question is one of, not being rude like the president. Because that is the example of what I call stupid, ignorant behavior. If you cannot have a conversation and sit and listen, that's where we are, people. We can't even listen to someone complete a thought without emoting a reaction. And I remember growing up in this city where that was not the case. I remember when Democrats and Republicans went to dinner and had conversations over dinner, even though they beat each other up during the day politically. We all like to lionize the behavior between Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, who beat the crap out of each other politically, but at the end of the day, had a glass of scotch and talked about the next day.
Well, I mean, to that point, Michael, I remember when I was producing Meet the Press in the early 90s, that we would routinely have the majority leader and the minority leader of the U.S. Senate on the show together for a half an hour substantive policy solution-driven discussion. When was the last time in the last 10 years you've seen leaders sit down like that and have a policy-focused discussion? It doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen, and I think that, again, goes to the state of where we've allowed our politics to go. So we have control over this at the end of the day, folks. We really do. It is not one person who gets to dictate how this democracy, this republic unfolds. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way, despite how much passion people have for Donald Trump. Like I said, I know the man. I don't know if you do, sir, but I do. And so I can tell you that the course we're on right now, it ain't good, all right? And you're either going to say it ain't good and do something about it, or you're going to accept it, and I don't want to hear you bitching afterwards, because that's where we are. And you need to understand that. You need to appreciate that. And you need to go into that space honestly and stop pretending that some elected official in the Republican Party is going to go down to the White House and tell the president, you need to change your behavior. That's not happening. Or that this is all going to get resolved because Adam Schiff is going to do an investigation. At the end of the day, it comes back to our doorstep because we, the people, are the government.
Let me ask you, Amy, because you are running a center here now based on policy. And what are your thoughts on, whether this election, I think obviously seen a preview of that, will be more focused on, these, issues about the president versus policy discussions, and what are your plans for the center and trying to have more policy-focused discussions?
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah. I think that, it's great when I sit here and I can say, yeah, Michael, yeah. And that's, I think, a lot of what the center's trying to get to as well, the Institute. I think, you hit the nail on the head. I worked in the Congress in the late 90s, and and I remember my Democratic member of Congress working with Republicans all of the time. So the question is, how do we find consensus? A lot of it is just trying to get together to have the conversation. The interesting thing on the Democratic side right now is we are talking about policy a lot in the Democratic debates. And a lot of that is because in this field that's very large, everybody's trying to position themselves, to their Democratic primary voters about how they would tackle these issues and what they would do to try to do things differently. At the end of the day, there's probably that much space between them. I think it's hard in some of these primary debates to try to show that there's a lot of space between them. But that's the conversation that I would hope would carry through the general. I'm concerned that it might not be. Simply because the leadership here is not talking about issues and is not talking about, what the solutions are to some of the biggest problems facing us as a nation. So the question of what the Institute certainly wants to look at is, where are these pockets of innovation happening? Where are these pockets happening, around the country? And this is why so much of the focus, and I understand because I sit there, watching it all day, talking, to former colleagues and to journalists and people on the Hill, is this national election. What's happening and what's really important is we have elections that are not just for the president, and with all due respect, the president is a very important part of our process, but who is making decisions for us at the federal level? Who is in our state legislatures deciding the issues that matter to us on a daily basis? This is the place where I think we can find consensus. There's really good examples of people trying to work together in various chambers throughout the country. These are some of the things that we're trying to highlight and shine out of the Institute. There's examples from history, huge, policy debates in the past where people have had to come together to find, consensus and do that. And it's happening and incubating a lot of times around the country and sometimes internationally, which we want to shine that light on too. I think we have an opportunity to push our elected officials in this election. And I want to remind everybody here, because there's probably a lot of you that live in Virginia, we have an election this year. So don't forget that, look and see when you have local elections, when you have, Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, there's elections this year. These matter. And I think sometimes we wait every 4 years to vote for one branch of our government when it matters all the time. And this is our responsibility to force the issue with our elected officials about what are the issues that we care about. And I think the really interesting thing is, what are people talking about and what are they concerned about in Iowa, in New Hampshire? You're on the road, you see it a lot. And, the question, for me is, what are the issues that they want to talk about? And I like when you have a healthy primary, and a lot of people are trying to get people's vote in these primaries, they do have to go to these states and talk about the issues and what they care about. I think we can still force that conversation to happen throughout the election.
Great, thank you. So Chris, Mr. New Hampshire, Chris is from New Hampshire. So, in fact, when Chris was an intern for us at Meet the Press, this is pre-Google, just to date ourselves, but during the summer when he was home, he would clip the articles before the, leading up to the presidential race, he would clip the articles out of the New Hampshire papers, put them in a manila envelope, and mail them to me at the show. So he knows a lot about New Hampshire. So talk about those early states, Chris, and how they are so important in the primary process, and what's your take as somebody from New Hampshire on the size, the influence that they play in the presidential primary process?
Yes, and one of the things I actually thought of this morning was, we always talk about the first website that political website we would pay attention to. It was Bob Dole's 1996 presidential campaign website. And about a month ago, ABC News shares all their information on distribution and email lists. So I get thousands of emails a day, and I've been there 5 years, and I still haven't figured out how to sort through everything. But I'm on everything. I'm on Good Morning America lists that talk about more pop culture stuff. And someone on Good Morning America sent around, hey, the Bob Dole website from 1996 is still around. And I was like, oh my God, no one knows like except us. That was like the coolest thing. And I was a really cool kid, as you can tell. I'm from New Hampshire. That's why I became interested in politics. That's why I wanted to come to Washington, to come to American. And just being able to go out and see the candidates and talk to them, meet them, I was on a panel with Bill Clinton in like December 1991 asking questions and stuff. What I think has been I think everyone would agree is a positive development over the past decades is used to be Iowa and New Hampshire, and less focus on very, very concentrated, two very white states, very very same kind of, in some cases, rural parts of New Hampshire and Iowa, and they had an inordinate amount of power to choose people. So I think both parties recognized that and started South Carolina, and one of the 9,000 reasons I'm not on TV is I never know how to pronounce things right, and I say Nevada, and I know there's a right way and a wrong way, and I don't say it the wrong way. But it is those early states. I think I went back and looked. I was fascinated. It's cliche in politics to say it's still early, you never know what's going to happen, but it's true. And the last two election cycles, Donald Trump took the lead in the Republican primary and then never gave it up. And Hillary Clinton was way ahead at the start, and Bernie Sanders had a challenge. But in 2012, the same thing. Obama was way ahead, and Romney kind of led for most of the campaign and stuff, especially this time. I went back to look in 2008, the open in both parties, and in this week, the ABC News Washington Post poll showed Hillary leading by 33 points over Barack Obama. So if you I know a lot has changed in 12 years, and a lot about Twitter, a lot about media, and a lot about how people do stuff. But on the Republican side, Rudy Giuliani was leading by 17 points over the late Fred Thompson. So we all know in 2008, Hillary Clinton was not the nominee, and there was never a Republican nominee, Giuliani or Fred Thompson. It has changed a lot. Those states are going to play a huge role. I really didn't answer your question.
No, that was great. But I mean, and the people in those states take it very seriously.
Yeah.
I was in New Hampshire a couple weeks ago and went to check out a Kamala Harris rally, and it was like a house party, in someone's backyard where they're talking to people, and she does her shtick, and then she makes the mistake of leaving right afterwards. Well, there was a line of people up at the volunteer table saying, "Wait a second, she needs to stick around. This is New Hampshire." And very upset they didn't get a selfie, they didn't get a personal conversation with her.
And it's the biggest, it's lessons learned too.
Right.
Like politicians, just like people have experiences, they learn stuff, they learn what worked, what didn't work. And Bernie Sanders is a perfect example of that. When he ran 4 years ago, he didn't really want to deal with selfies, he didn't really want to deal with, he was going to just give a big speech and then talk to people and go to the next thing. And he learned from the import of the actually shaking people's hands and talking to people, and now both him and Elizabeth Warren tell how many selfies they do constantly and stuff. It makes a huge difference between, it's kind of a cliche, but a lot of people say in both Iowa and New Hampshire, when reporters like Robert go up to them and ask them, what are you thinking and stuff, what do you think of this person, this candidate, they say, well, I don't know, I've only seen them 3 or 4 times, I'm going to have to meet them a lot more before I decide, because it is a luxury those states have. They do take it seriously. And to your point about policy, what's really interesting is they ask mostly policy questions. For the first 6 months of this first year of this Democratic primary, almost to a T, all the Democratic candidates said, look, no one in the country is talking about the Mueller report. They're talking about, we have to do that, but I'm talking about policy. They kept repeating that over and over again. It's one of the unknowns that we're going to find out if the Democrats keep saying that, or if they keep, and that's what Nancy Pelosi and all the Democrats in Congress, I think, have been telling Robert and other reporters this week, that they're going to go back, they're going back to their district, and the smart ones are saying that they're listening. Other people are saying, I'm going to explain it. Right?
Yeah.
But most of the members are saying we're going to be listening to what people think about what's happened the last couple of weeks and stuff.
Yeah, and the candidates are they're much more accessible in those early states. And in fact, I'll put a plug in for a class that I'm co-teaching next semester that we did last cycle as well on the presidential primaries, where we actually take students to New Hampshire during the primary, and this year we're going to also take students to South Carolina. So it's a great time for them to be on the ground. The candidates are accessible. They can see so much and learn so much from those early states. Bob, do you want to say something?
Just a quick point in addition to Chris's great points. When you think about the age we're living in, the age of Trump, where the president is ubiquitous and the news every day is 24/7, relentless and nationalized, I would argue, based on my reporting on the 2020 race over the past 6 months, that the early states matter in terms of deciding who gets delegates and who gets momentum, but this entire race is nationalized, and what really matters more than candidate performance or connecting with early state voters is your message. And the biggest story in the Democratic race right now is the ascent of Senator Warren. And when you try to understand why that's happening as a reporter, you see an immense overlap with the message of President Trump. Let me explain. When I was on the campaign trail in 2016, I was on the Bernie beat, I was on the Trump beat. There was this grievance politics, economic populism pervasive in the country, reacting to disappointment about the global economy, about the lack of opportunity, perceived lack of opportunity, the fracturing of the family, the rise of the opioid crisis, that led President Trump to break through with many independent voters by saying, I am radical change against the global economy, and I blame the immigrant. Senator Warren is essentially saying to those same voters, I too am radical change, but instead of blaming the immigrant, I am blaming the corporation. And that is cutting through in a Democratic Party that has long embraced establishment messaging on healthcare and the economy. And when I'm talking to people inside of the White House, they are alarmed at times at Senator Warren's ascent, because when they look at Vice President Biden, they see someone, and they argue, they could run against as the establishment, and President Trump could once again be, in their eyes, the change candidate. But when they see Senator Warren drawing 20,000 people in New York, they see a competitor in terms of movement politics. And so she has an economic populist message that speaks to voters in these times. And she's poised to do well in New Hampshire, in Iowa. New Hampshire is her neighboring state of Massachusetts. The real question facing her candidacy right now, between now and the early of 2020, is can she win over minority voters in places like South Carolina and peel away at Vice President Biden's coalition. And if she can do that, she'll head into that California primary in March, and others well poised to be the nominee.
And the interesting thing about the California primary is that Kamala Harris, the native daughter, is running fourth in California. I remember doing a program on MS about a year ago, a little less now, about the fact that I thought someone like Kamala would have a problem in her home state for a whole lot of reasons, and the Elizabeth Warren campaign, I think, has made it very difficult for the Democrats to do a much more sort of emotional kind of connective campaign, which we've seen in the past, because she's come up, she's got a plan for pretty much everything. And you have to, as a competitor, at some point, address her plan. And as we've seen in the run-up to this debate next week, I think Mayor Pete Buttigieg is prepared to go after her on her plan. I think a few others are prepared to do the same. So the next test for her, as the Klieg light gets brighter and the focus of that light gets narrower on her, how does she respond, not from an attack from her right, from Republicans or Trump, but from her left? And that's going to be interesting, particularly given that, yet again, when asked about whether or not the middle class would have to pay for her health care plan, she averted. She has yet to answer that question directly. And that's going to be, while it's a great posture and a great position to kind of do the dive with, on a stage with, fewer than 10 people, one staring in your face, looking at you, it's going to be hard to get around that. So that's going to be the test moment for her. She passes that, then I think you're going to see a widening in the gap between her and the others as folks resettle. One other point real quick. don't get confused by the money, people, all right? Because raising money is easy, all right? Because it speaks a lot to popularity, it speaks a lot to your on-the-ground ability to reach people, because what you're seeing is Bernie Sanders, $25 million, he's trailing Elizabeth Warren, all right? But you also see Biden, 15 million, and he's second or first, depending on the poll you're looking at. So what you're seeing happen in the primary process is folks saying with the money, and of course Pete Buttigieg is a good example, you know, raising all this money, but he's running 5%, 6%. All right, and people scratch their head. Well, what that says is, yeah, I'll give you some money, but I'm voting for her. And that's perfectly okay.
Giving to a couple different candidates,
yeah, and
right?
they give to a couple of different candidates. So I don't think we can, when you hear reporters and others out there kind of making a big deal about the money as an indicator of something, all it indicates is a lot of people want to write them a check. And what you need to look at is, and I think Bob made a very good point about the national poll. These candidates are now running in 4 states, but they're being polled as if they're running in all 50 states. And so it doesn't matter what they're polling in California, it doesn't matter what they're polling in Maryland, my home state, it doesn't matter what they're polling in Florida. What matters is how they're polling in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and then Nevada.
I know we want to get to some audience questions, but I want to just follow up with you on one quick point on Elizabeth Warren, Michael. If she is the nominee, given what you know about the Republican Party, do you think that her message would be appealing to sort of the disaffected Republicans, because she is obviously more progressive?
Yeah.
Can she resonate? Can she get votes of the anti-Trump vote in a general election?
That's a little bit hard to really digest right now. I have actually seen polling that reminded me of polling that was done in the President Bush 41 re-elect effort. And that was polling that showed that when you laid out the policy, a significant number of voters liked the policy. When you attached the name, they were like, it cut in half.
So like Obamacare.
It's like Obamacare and the ACA. When you poll people on the ACA, 55–60% support. When you attached Obama's name, it dropped to 30%. So I think with Elizabeth Warren, there's a little bit of that going on. There are some features of what she's saying, going back to what Bob was saying about the Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump voter in 2016, and that was actually a person. I met a lot of them because of the very way that circle kind of completed itself around globalization and the economy and how people were being treated. I think she can make that case, but where I think she will fall down with a lot of those sort of center-right, independent, and Republican voters is the explicit nature of what she's going to do on the border, what she's going to do with her health care plan, whether or not she's actually going to require me to give up my health care plan to go into her health care plan. And so I think that's where we're going to wait and see whether or not that really resonates to the point where she can pull those voters. And then, of course, like you said, the whole minority piece as well is going to be interesting.
Great, thank you. So let's take some audience questions. Yes, right here. Do we have a mic or anything that goes around? Or hold on with your mic. Thanks. Can you introduce yourself? Absolutely. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Elliot Bell Krasner. I'm an SPA alum from 2012 and a member of AU's alumni board. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Amy, thank you very much for your leadership of the Sine Institute, which is really fantastic. Robert and Chris, thank you so much for what you do. Freedom of the press in America is incredibly important, one of our absolute most important rights, and thank you very much, especially with everything going on. And Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your honesty, because I remember the days when you were highly critical of the Obama administration and some of the things that the party said back then, and to hear you, being able to criticize the party now is refreshing, to be perfectly honest. My question is this: it's really aimed at the chairman, but more, over also, for all of you. Given what the president has done recently with some of his actions and how blatant he has been in saying that it's perfectly acceptable for him to, he says, investigate corruption, but essentially use the power of his office to investigate one of his chief political opponents going into the 2020 election cycle, no matter who the nominee is. What does this mean for the election, and what does it mean for our democracy to have an election cycle where you potentially have a president using the power of his office to try to influence the election in a way that our democracy was not designed to deal with?
I think that's an incredibly good and important question, and it really relates back to what I was saying before about how we respond to this. This is all very new. We have an expectation of individuals who hold that office to adhere to the principles and the ideals of it, but most importantly, uphold the Constitution. The Constitution is at once explicit, other times vague about certain things, certainly relating to the behavior of the occupants of office. There is no real clue, but we sort of, intuit and impute a certain attitude, if you will. So I think this is our test in how we digest what we're seeing, and whether or not when the president says, I have the absolute right to fill in the blank. Never in the history, our modern history. Now, I don't know what Jefferson said when he was president. I don't know what Adams may have said. But I know that in our modern hearing, we've never had a president stand up before the American people and say, I have an absolute right to do whatever I want to do. What's the appropriate check on that? You. When you have a party on one side that's too scared to move, and the party on the other side that sometimes is too zealous to move, the appropriate check is you. How do you hear that? And that's going to be ultimately the answer. I think it was a very interesting point that I believe you raised, Chris, about the election cycle in next year, and whether or not voters, if we should wait and let this play itself out at the ballot box. I kind of fall more in that camp because I really want to test us. I really want to test us. That's the stress test, the ballot box. I've heard a lot of people on the left bemoaning and groaning about what happened in 2016, and then you look at the number of people who stayed home and didn't come out to vote. And so I want to stress test that. I want to stress test on the right as well. That when the president says, I have an absolute right to do something, what's your response to that? You believe that? Really? You believe that? And so when that absolute right begins to infringe on your right, are you okay with that? So that for me is going to be an interesting dynamic in this next cycle. And I think, to your question, it really is going to rest on us ultimately to decide how this story ends.
Well, just one quick addition to this. Michael rightly keeps talking about the election being a check, but the first check on the executive is supposed to, by our Constitution, be Congress. And Congress is being historically tested. They're being brought to the brink of what it means to be the oversight branch. Congress, in the last 10 years, has already broken down as a legislative branch. Almost nothing is accomplished with significance in terms of big bipartisan deals. We saw the collapse of the fiscal deal in 2011, the collapse of the immigration discussions in 2013. I could go on and on. Unless a party has total control, like the Republicans in 17 and 18, or the Democrats in 09-10, nothing gets done. And you're seeing now Congress being refused from the executive, subpoenas, witnesses, and you're also seeing, in an unprecedented way, members of President Trump's inner circle, the Attorney General of the United States conducting his own investigation of the DOJ and the Mueller investigation, the Secretary of State being involved in these political and diplomatic arrangements and pursuits of President Trump, Vice President Pence, as I said at the beginning, being told to be a messenger to President Zelensky. The executive branch, beyond just the president who's beyond the mainstream and combative, is now being pulled into this riptide without any guardrails that were there when I was covering President Trump early on. The John Kellys of the world, the Jim Mattises, they're gone. And you now have a cabinet that's working in lockstep with President Trump as he pursues different diplomatic, political ambitions, and you have a Republican Party that is historically weak as it does not know how to navigate in this moment with its own voters.
Okay, one question right here. Yeah. Can you talk loud?
Yes, okay.
Okay.
I'm just going to try to get this simply because I had two questions, but I'm trying to stick to one. So my daughter is a freshman here, and last night we were having dinner with her, and it was actually just a fascinating conversation. And we started on the impeachment and about the timing of it. And then it delved into journalism and how journalism used to be facts, then analysis, then opinion.
Right.
And now, I guess what I'm trying to bring back to when we were talking about the people is as I came from California on train coming across, what I find is that the majority of the people still go off little sound bites. They don't have the time to delve into looking through. In the election, well, you're talking to this audience, I believe most of this audience is probably more informed and does want to, but your average voter is more looking at the social media, the headlines, and they're being reactive. And how do you get to influence people to see how important it is with the Constitution and what's going on when the day-to-day person is only looking at these reactive sound bites?
Right. So the question for anybody that didn't hear is how do we get from just the snippets and sound bites to more substance? And also, what role does sort of mainstream media versus sort of the more opinionated media play in that? Amy, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest concerns for me, and as I've seen in the trajectory of my career, is when I worked for members of Congress, when they had a local media outlet that actually, on a day-to-day basis, either held them accountable and asked them the right questions, or also helped to highlight the good things they were doing within their own community. I think the biggest concern for me is that a lot of that has broken down. And you think about if we had these local news outlets today, these members you mentioned were going back to their districts, would they be asked the hard questions about impeachment? Would they be asked the hard questions about what is your job and what is your responsibility? I appreciate that we have to go to where people are consuming information, and again, it's, we all feed into, Twitter and some of these, places where they get information. I think the biggest challenge is when I first started working as an operative in campaigns, what we would do is throw information out and the people would come and consume it. And now what we have to do is go where they're consuming it and give them, we have the ability to do it, give them exactly tailored information to what they're most concerned about. I do think that we have to find a way in communities to find some kind of news source partnering with national media or something so that they are held accountable or they are asked the questions when they are at home. And I think reinvesting in that and finding ways to do that, whether it's in online social channels or it's within the community, it's a big concern. Because I've had members say they don't even have the ability to go home and talk about what they're doing because there's no way to consume that. I think the other big challenge is, and I have respect for everybody, on the stage, and especially for you using your voice out there, Michael, but I think what we've done is put journalism and punditry in the same category. And even when we're having a panel on CNN, we never differentiate between who's giving their opinion and who's reporting the facts. And I think we can do a better job to make sure we're being very clear about that. And so when people are consuming that in these various places they're getting it, to make sure they're understanding that it's opinion versus reporting.
Yeah, and I'll put a plug in for Bob's show, Washington Week, because you have journalists around the table and you're doing analysis, no punditry, on Fridays. So if you want to see real journalists talk about journalism.
Real quick, I think I really appreciate that, Betsy. Washington Week only has reporters, no columnists, no newsmakers. Sorry, Michael.
I was never asked that.
So sometimes congressmen will come up to me in the hall, they'll be like, so, Washington Week, can I be on? And I'll be like, you don't understand the show. But I think one of the real challenges is I talk about the Congress being tested as an institution, the press is being tested as an institution, and I try so much as a reporter at the Post, at PBS, and NBC to be very careful to stay down the center, because as much as half the country seems to come up to me on the campaign trail and say, thanks so much for what you're doing, you all are heroes, I'm very aware that 50%, if not more, I don't know what the number is, do not see the press in that way at all. Now, the institutional credibility of the press has been significantly eroded by attacks from the right, fake news, but also attacks from the left. Senator Sanders saying corporate media and those types of things. And so we, as an institution, have to wake up every day, I believe, as reporters, and not pat ourselves on the back, to not act like we're political actors at all, to resist being politicized, to stick to reporting, and let the story tell itself.
It's a little bit of a weird thing for me to move out of politics into the media space, and to your point, oh my gosh, the line gets blurred so quickly. But to the journalism students in the room and those who may see this, if you want an example, and I'm not blowing smoke here, I'm not saying this because I've known this guy a long time, but right here, no, I'm gonna give you an example. I'm gonna give you an example. Whenever you hear Costa on air, whether it's on my network or his own program, he starts the conversation this way, according to my reporting. And what you hear next is going to be based on his factual understanding and representation of those facts. He makes it very clear, this isn't my opinion. This is according to reporting that you can go check me on. A good reporter will start their conversation and even necessarily end their conversation by letting you know, according to my reporting, according to the sources that I'm speaking with, according to the notes in front of me that were dictated by, by the conversation I had with Senator X. So for those of you who are looking at journalism as a profession, you have the opportunity to learn by watching those men and women who are out here every day, like Chris and like Robert, and even those behind the scenes like Betsy, who put that integrity out there by saying to the public first, according to my reporting.
Well, thank you, Michael. And according to the fact that the dean here, I think, is giving me the hook. I think we're going to have to end it there, but I wanted to thank you all very much for being here, and thank you to the great panel for your